Good morning, everyone. My name is Remco Lemus, and I'm the acting director of the AJC office here in Berlin. First of all, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy who is on this call. And before we start, just a quick reminder, excuse me, that you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of Mark's lecture. To do so, you can send your questions via the question button at the bottom of the screen. Our topic today, Russian disinformation, was relevant before the COVID-19 pandemic, and as the last weeks have shown, is still at play today. Towards the end of March, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and the Federal Police here in Germany declared that they are closely monitoring Russia Today's German outlet for aggressively pushing disinformation and fake news related to the virus. For example, a video titled "The Pandemic That Never Was," as of yesterday, has been viewed 850,000 times. Additionally, the European Union's Counter-Disinformation Task Force published a study last week which found 152 cases of fake news and disinformation from Russian sources. According to the study, the Kremlin has not changed course in pro-Russian media outlets, and online bots continue to push conspiracy theories concerning the coronavirus. For example, that gay marriage is responsible for the virus, or pushing contradictory stories that accusing the West of not doing enough to fight the pandemic, and at the same time pushing stories saying that the West is overreacting. And while the regime in Russia is continuing its disinformation campaign as before, it has also launched a public diplomacy offensive, delivering some medical aid to Italy, which, according to the media, is largely unusable. Nonetheless, the Kremlin seems to be interested in generating these kinds of photo ops. So what strategy is the Kremlin pursuing with its ongoing disinformation policy, and how does it relate to the activities presenting Russia as a responsible actor on the international stage? We are pleased and delighted to welcome this morning Mark Gagliotti to discuss these and other questions. Mark is honorary professor at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He's an expert in modern Russia, especially its security politics, and is currently working on projects exploring non-kinetic forms of warfighting. Prolific author, his most recent books are The Worry, Russia's Super Mafia, Russian Political War, published in 2019, and We Need to Talk About Putin, which was published in 2019. So without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours, and thank you for agreeing to be with us this morning, and we are looking forward hearing your thoughts and insights on Russia's disinformation campaign.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in the new COVID-19 style of presentations. Okay, well, what I want to do is start very much from the big picture and then narrow it down to look specifically at where COVID-19 fits into the Russian disinformation campaign, and in some ways, particularly what it throws up about some of the weaknesses and contradictions in the way the Russians have been using disinformation. But anyway, to start with the big picture, the reason why the Russians use disinformation is essentially as part of their current campaign of what I would call political warfare against the West. You've got to realize that when the world is viewed from the Kremlin, it's a very, very different place from the one that we recognize. And however bizarre and conspiratorial their view is, I think for many in the Kremlin, there's a genuine belief that the West is actually opposed fundamentally to Russia and Russia asserting its rightful place in the world. I'm often struck by how smart, well-educated, cosmopolitan Russians within the broad security world, shall we say, including the think tanks that advise and so forth in Moscow, nonetheless genuinely seem to hold to this notion that it's actually the West that is trying to hold Russia down. It's nonsense in the main, 85% nonsense. But nonetheless, that actually is sort of one of the key mainsprings of what's going on. And given that Putin, particularly since his return to power after his little sojourn as prime minister, seems motivated above all by this almost messianic sense of wanting to bring Russia back to its proper place in the world. Russia has been lifted up off its knees. He accounted, obviously. He left it clear who had done the lifting. The challenge for Russia is, okay, how do you push back against a West that on almost any index is vastly more powerful? It doesn't obviously GDP, but also soft power, technological power, all these indices of 21st century power. And the answer is they have shifted to a form of guerrilla geopolitics, which is like any good guerrilla, you move the battlefield from where your enemies are strong to where they're weak. And from their point of view, what is the West's weakness? Well, the answer is that we are a constellation of democracies with all the consequent disagreements and disputes within and between our countries. Now, obviously, I think we would all agree that that's actually a very good thing that we are a constellation of democracies, but nonetheless, from the Russians' point of view, that actually is our vulnerability. That we are therefore vulnerable to political struggles against us, intended to divide us, first of all, because the West is vastly more powerful than Russia when we are a collective unit. But most individual Western countries are not. I mean, the Russian aim is very much to try and bring back bilateral relationships. Because if they can actually treat each individual Western country on an individual basis, they're often in a stronger position. So to divide us. And also because by dividing us between our countries and within our countries, it neutralizes us. It basically keeps us so busy in our own internal discussions that we don't have political bandwidth to deal with Russia. The second aim, again, it's a nice little trinity of Ds, as well as dividing us, they want to distract us. There is a sense, essentially, that the West is the attention deficit disorder society. That today we are incredibly committed to a particular topic. It is a priority, we must do something, and oh, shiny, suddenly something else comes along. And all of a sudden, all those efforts are actually sort of distracted. So there is that sense of obviously trying to keep us constantly thinking that there is other things that are more important than Russia and what Russia may be doing. I mean, this is one of the key issues about Syria and the Middle East, the extent to which it actually acts as a constant distractor because also of migrant issues and everything else. And the third D is to demoralize us, is to make us think that, look, actually the Russian challenge is so unpredictable, so serious, so threatening, that actually it is better for us to reach some kind of a deal with Russia. And if that means giving Russia things that we really shouldn't, including, for example, essentially sovereignty over its own sphere of influence, then so be it. So to divide us, to distract us, to demoralize us, and in that respect to neutralize us in the aim of, well, what is it that Putin wants? I don't believe for a minute that he wants to recreate the Soviet Union or recreate the Tsarist Empire. I think that beyond Crimea, the Russians had no territorial ambitions. I mean, even if one looks at what's going on in southeastern Ukraine, if they wanted to annex it, they could have annexed it by now. This was never about the Donbass. It was always about using that as an instrument against Kiev. And that's the key thing. Putin is basically a 19th century geopolitician. He doesn't think about, he doesn't care about the issues of soft power and so forth. A great power has a sphere of influence, countries whose sovereignty is subordinated to the metropolis. So Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, these are countries that have to realize that, sure, they can run themselves up to a point, but ultimately they are beholden to Moscow, in his view. Secondly, a great power has a voice, and voice means a veto, on every single important issue in the world. Things cannot be resolved without Russia being at the table. And if it's not, and we've seen this, for example, with Venezuela, then in a way, Russia will act as a spoiler. And the third element is that a great power gets to break the rules from time to time. Again, I don't believe Putin wants to just simply destroy the entire framework of the international order. No country that shares the largest land border in the world with a rapidly rising and arming China wants to see things devolve into absolute might makes right anarchy. But instead, a great power, because this is how he thinks Putin, and this is how he thinks America acts, has from time to time the right to be able to say, look, yeah, we broke the rules, but that was necessary for our national interests, live with it. Now, obviously, these are things we cannot and will not allow him to have, because obviously to do so would be a betrayal of the basic sort of fundamental notions of 21st century sovereignty and 21st century way in which the world is meant to operate. But so long as we're in this struggle, he's trying to get us to commit to basically giving him a grand bargain that he wants. Now, where does disinformation fit into all of this? Well, essentially, disinformation is one of the very many instruments of Russian political war. And it's the one that we talk about the most, often because it's the one that's most visible. The much more kind of covert instruments of corruption, for example, will strike our attention much more rarely. But because disinformation is precisely, it's played out in the sphere of public discourse, it's what we notice. And therefore, sometimes we slightly, I think, overplay it. Disinformation is essentially there to disrupt us. It is not usually to convince us of anything. This is the interesting thing. Putinism is not like the old Soviet Union in that it has no ideology beyond just simply its own self-interest and its own power. It doesn't want to, it doesn't try to convince us. Putin's not trying to tell us that we should adopt, I don't know, Russian social values or become Russian Orthodox or anything like that. He doesn't care. And this is one of the reasons why disinformation is so powerful and so pernicious. It's precisely that basically it can play to every single alternative perspective. To the outright, Putin can present Russia, or Russia can be presented rather, as the champion of traditional values against sort of degenerative liberalism and so forth of the West. To the left, Putin can present Russia as being, you know, the one country that is holding back American domination of the world order. It doesn't matter basically what your particular perspective is. They will essentially seek to play to your prejudices, play to your own interests, and more or less say, yes, you're absolutely right. And here's a crucial point. There's very, very little evidence that Russian disinformation actually changes people's minds. It's not actually that someone is a convinced supporter of NATO who suddenly sort of incautiously watches RT and suddenly says, oh my God, the scales have been lifted from my eyes. I realize that this is actually an evil hegemonic plot from Washington. No. What Russian disinformation does is try to radicalize. It takes existing perspectives and pushes it into much, much more strident positions and makes people feel that perhaps they have to act on this. I mean, it's interesting, what one can do is look at, for example, the case study of Scottish nationalism at the time of the Scottish vote for independence. Now, clearly the Russians were very supportive of that notion, and RT in particular was very, very visible as a supportive platform for Scottish nationalist perspectives. Now, again, insofar as we do have data, and it's still sort of being worked through, shall we say, but insofar as we do, it's very clear exactly that at no point did people become Scottish nationalists because of Russian disinformation. Instead, what happened is people who had a mild commitment to the idea that probably it might be better if Scotland was more autonomous from London were convinced to go to a full independent stand. And people who were sort of generally predisposed towards independence were made much more likely to vote. And that's often the key thing. It takes people to say, actually, you must act on this. So to this end, it very much, it's reaching out and seeking to be all things to all people. And this is one of the reasons why the Russians have adopted the kind of particular approach that they have. We often like to think there is some kind of grand narrative being pushed and the Kremlin is behind it all. It's not the way it generally works. Best case study I had is actually I once went drinking with some people, some Westerners who worked for RT in Moscow. In some ways, I almost feel sorry for them in the sense of they joined RT when it wasn't that bad a TV network. I mean, it still actually has some good programs on it today, but they didn't jump quickly enough. And now their resumes have become totally toxic. So unless they want to go and work for, I don't know, Radio Pyongyang or whatever, they're basically not going to find alternative jobs. And so they're stuck there. Which actually is an interesting side point. Some of them are actually very good. If we really were serious about fighting Russian disinformation, what we'd actually be doing is trying to find them jobs. So we get the good ones and get them out of RT. That's a little sideline. Anyway, I was talking to them and I said, okay, well, how does it work? And do you get the metaphorical phone call from the Kremlin or whatever? And they said, well, no. Sometimes it does happen. And the classic example is when the airliner MH17 was shot down over the Donbass, when suddenly there was a very clear sense of, okay, this is a crisis and we have a strategy. Most of the time, though, all that happens is some news comes over the newswire, and you have a bunch of smart, imaginative, moderately morally bankrupt individuals, all separately thinking, okay, what can we do with this? How can we spin this? What can we juxtapose it with, or whatever? And you may well have 4 or 5 different ideas that will then appear in 4 or 5 different packages on the program that may well be entirely contradictory, but they're the result of individual initiatives. And they're all hoping that theirs is the one that someone higher up the food chain thinks, I like that. Yeah, that works well. And you suddenly find it being picked up and magnified elsewhere. And the chief propagandist Dmitry Kiselyov mentioning it on his toxic Sunday evening sort of current affairs rant or whatever. So they're all hoping that theirs will be picked up. And this is the key point. This is the model. What the Russians have done is basically, I won't say privatized, but certainly sort of created this essentially autonomous ecosystem of propagandists of every kind. Online trolls, paranoid bloggers, talk show types, who basically sort of rant about whatever the issue of the day is. All these things, they are all coming up with content, and they're pitching their ideas up the food chain, hoping that theirs will be picked up. And what we see, when we actually see that happening, that's a point when suddenly an individual bit of disinformation becomes the center of a multimedia, multi-platform campaign. That suddenly something that someone has said is now going to be used as a soundbite in a foreign ministry briefing or pushed out by local embassy Twitter feed. And at the same time is something that maybe we will see manifest in policy. And at the same time, we will start seeing the intelligence services covertly encouraging other particular sort of individuals under their control to magnify it. And at the same time, we may well find cyber attacks hitting people who are trying to combat that particular narrative. So this is the key point. It's from time to time, we will see ideas from below being picked up from above and suddenly becoming the essence of a multi-platform strategy, initiative. Now, when we come to COVID, what's interesting is, yes, of course, there's massive amounts of disinformation in various Russian platforms. And a fair amount, I think we have to be careful here. Sometimes what we call disinformation, and certainly sometimes some of the things that one finds, for example, the European Union's Stratcom East Task Force describing as disinformation, we actually, frankly, could just simply call commentary. It's not entirely inappropriate to say that the European Union did not move quickly on COVID, and that the first instincts of European countries were not actually mutually supportive, but quite the opposite. They were about, well, what is our own interest and so forth. So actually to be saying that and discussing that and promoting that is not, it is mischievous, it is politically biased and so forth, but it's not technically disinformation. But anyway, moving on. Yes, there is a lot. But again, most of what the Russians are doing is taking existing narratives, other people's narratives, and magnifying them. And some of it is Chinese, for example. The Chinese, by contrast with the Russians, actually are clearly launching a very, very extensive, ambitious, aggressive, and coordinated program. But a lot of it comes from elsewhere. Again, there's a recent account that suggests that this notion that COVID may have appeared originally from an American biological warfare project, which is clearly a sort of, exactly the kind of narrative that they're looking for, originated actually in the United States. Again, so actually a lot of what the Russians are doing is just finding the convenient narratives that suit their various sort of objectives and magnifying it. But at the same time, what's really quite interesting is that this is actually running at odds with this attempt to basically use this crisis for soft power and diplomatic purposes. We had Putin at the virtual G20 last month, trying to say, well, look, this is a moment where we all need to sort of pull together. And for example, that means suspending a moratorium on sanctions. Well, clearly, from that point of view, this is a particular strategic imperative of the Russians to try and get the sanctions lifted, or at least undermine the rationale for the sanctions that have been levied on them ever since their illegal annexation of Crimea. With the sort of shipment to Italy, which may have been 80% useless, it may not. I mean, this is we have one anonymous source in La Stampa that said it. It wouldn't surprise me, because essentially this was, again, a geopolitical gambit. Italy, anyway, is a country that sort of historically and politically has quite close ties to Russia. They regard it as one of the sort of the vulnerable points, shall we say, within the continental European Union, and therefore they're seeking to make some gains. Well, fair enough. I mean, to be blunt, that is the nature of modern international relations, isn't it? But more generally, there is this campaign to try and use it as an attempt to an extent, reset the relationship. And we're seeing that, a lot of the sort of the narratives that are coming out from, for example, individual embassies in different Western countries is pushing this "we're all in it together" line. It's very hard to sustain that at the same time as you're pumping out disinformation, saying that basically, this is something that your allies cooked up, and that your leadership doesn't care about you, and that in fact people are dying, but no one's telling you the truth, and all the other sort of nonsense. And I think this tells us one of the interesting things about the weaknesses of the Russian campaign. The way that they've created this essentially self-sustaining machine that constantly pumps out propaganda and disinformation it's relatively cheap, it's relatively deniable. It does create a whole wealth of different narratives. There's one of these sort of memes about the weaponization, the weaponization of everything. Well, in this case, it's about the weaponization of the imagination and the ambitions of a whole variety of different Russian actors, because they're all hoping that theirs is going to be the idea that gets picked up. That comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of control. It's a lot harder for the Kremlin to actually be able to sort of manage this in detail, because in a way, the Kremlin doesn't have contact directly with many of these agencies. It's not actually that these people are all at the end of a phone line and that the Kremlin press agency or whoever is giving them their orders every week. Often they're basically running their campaigns based on how they believe the Kremlin wants them to act. So they're looking at formal statements and so forth and thinking, aha, I know what they would like to see. Well, unless the Kremlin is actually going to basically come clean and say, yeah, by the way, all you propagandists and disinformation warriors out there, would you mind just sort of keeping it down for a bit? Which immediately undermines their case that they have no control over it. It also, they don't want to destroy, in effect, a sort of a force of volunteers and information mercenaries that they may well be needing again in the future. So what we actually have is an interesting sort of effort in which actually there's lots of disinformation being pumped out, but it's almost on, if I can mix my metaphor slightly, autopilot. What we haven't really seen are these coordinated, concentrated campaigns to take various memes and lines and turn them into sort of messages that are being pumped out across a whole variety of different platforms and channels. And again, I think that speaks to the fact that at the moment, the government is finding this rather uncomfortable position. And so my sort of final point that I want to close on is precisely this, that actually, what we're actually seeing is that the Kremlin at the moment is suffering from its disinformation campaigns. Disinformation campaign that it could clamp down if it was willing to pay the price for, but it's unwilling to do so at the moment. It's undermining its efforts to present itself as a new friend in the COVID era. Actually, every time it tries this, it then finds itself being tripped up by the fact that there's still this nonsense, often dangerous nonsense, being pushed out. Secondly, it's a problem in that actually it's finding itself now trapped between two particular narratives. as I say, China at the moment is very much trying to sort of push this very aggressive narrative that says, no, 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 you know, this is not the Chinese flu, the Chinese virus, as Donald Trump has called it. It's not Wu flu. Instead, actually, China is at the forefront of efforts to deal with it. It may well have been, I mean, there have been these very, very clumsy attempts precisely to link it to American military personnel who were in Wuhan at the end of last year. And instead, it's China that is the one reliable ally that you have in this pandemic age. So that's one narrative. And then you have a Western narrative, which actually is obviously much more fact-based and is increasingly not just critical of China in terms of its initial response and its secretiveness, but actually increasingly questioning a lot of the data that is coming out of China. And the reason why this matters is it's not just simply a Chinese issue. It's because obviously the more data we have and the more reliable data we have, the better a chance we have to actually model the virus and be able to work out meaningful strategies on that basis. So actually, if China is lying about what happened, that is actually also having a direct impact on our own capacity to model the progress of the virus. Russia finds itself in the middle. The interesting thing is actually, if you look at a lot of Russian discourse about the Chinese numbers, in a quiet and rather kind of awkward way, it's clear that the Russian experts are also questioning the Chinese data. At the same time, though, they find themselves in a situation where they are, you know, locked in this political war with the West and notionally allies of the Chinese. Chinese are their great strategic partners. I mean, although in fact the Russians don't trust the Chinese in the slightest. But increasingly, what you're finding, the Russians are also caught in an embarrassing, awkward sort of position of stranded between the two sets of narratives. There was interesting at the end of last month, a press conference which actually Foreign Ministry spokesperson was asked, how would you comment about these allegations that in fact it came from, you know, Americans in China? And I almost felt sorry for the individual, as desperate attempts were being made to try and slide round the realities of the situation. On the one hand saying, well, no one country should be blamed for this virus. But as regards the American trace, we have no information on this. Was trying desperately just to not take any kind of position. Again, having positioned itself as essentially a sort of a pillar of disinformation, when that disinformation is politically dangerous for Russia, it doesn't really know how to act. And the third and final way why this is dangerous is actually, we should note that most of the nonsense that the Russians are talking about coronavirus is not directed towards us. It is actually in Russian, being read by Russians, consumed by Russians. And so everything from, again, claims about sort of, you know, where it came from, all the way through to whether or not garlic or vodka or prayer or kissing an icon will actually cure the virus. These very kind of pernicious narratives, which for a while were going pretty much unchallenged within the Russian media, actually, you know, are all acting as impediments to the attempts of the Russians now to actually have some kind of proper and serious response to what is almost certainly going to be a very problematic virus for Russia as it spreads, particularly as it spreads beyond Moscow, as it spreads to areas that have much, much fewer resources in their health systems. So I think in conclusion, to sort of wrap up my view, you know, for the Russians, disinformation is an absolutely central part of the political war that they're fighting against the West. A political war that, from their point of view, is intended to neutralize us and to make us more inclined either to just not be able to resist Russia as it does what it wants to do in its own backyard, or more inclined to actually make some kind of deal which would sanctify those actions of Russia. However, the way they've done it is, instead of being a massive, carefully coordinated and expensive top-down propaganda machine, as for example we saw in Soviet times, instead it's a postmodern, decentralized, bottom-up kind of disinformation machine. It's cheaper, it allows a whole variety of different messages to be sent out at the same time. And that's fine so long as it works. But what it does mean is they have much, much less control over it. And when all of a sudden they find that actually the issue of the moment is not one that lends itself to these kind of neat evil West squeezing Russia, but a rather different kind of information message, it's much harder for them to control. I don't actually think this is going to lead to any major change in Russian policy. Because I think they basically feel that they cannot waste their disinformation army. But on the other hand, I think it does show the weaknesses of the current Russian approach. Anyway, I'll stop it there because I know we're time sensitive, and that can throw it open to questions or indeed disagreements.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your very, very interesting insights. I will just remind you that if you have a question, you can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and I will use my privilege as moderator to ask the first question. So you talked about this, maybe we can call it grassroots environment of disinformation, that you have all these institutions and all these troll farms that are working semi-independent from the Kremlin. But you also talked about that at some point up the ladder, someone is deciding which line they're going to push. So just to understand how the Russian regime is working, who is that? Is that Peskov? Is that someone, you know, more down in the Kremlin? So I mean, who's picking that up, or are there also competing people inside the Kremlin that are pitching them to whomever these different narratives?
It's a very interesting question, and you know, I wish I actually had an absolute solid answer to say it's this person or it's this department. But again, I think and as you've intimated, I mean, reflecting the way that Putin's Kremlin works, a lot of it is still quite competitive. You have a variety of different actors, and in some ways, the best way of looking at it is, you know, we're used to thinking of this country as a pyramid, the so-called power vertical, with kind of orders coming from, you know, there's Putin at the top, there's his lieutenants, and there's a whole structure with orders flowing down. Well, it is a pyramid, but in this respect, actually, it's a pyramid that flows up. So what one has is a whole variety of different kind of, shall I say, levels of curating. So within, again, I'll use the example of RT. I mean, it's clearly that there are significant people within RT who may well look at the different kind of messages that are being put out by different programs, different individuals, and some they will think, yes, that's a really good one. Let's sort of push that more generally. But then there are people above, and yes, I think this is a particular area in which the presidential administration, which is the absolutely crucial organ of governance within Putin's Russia. I mean, it is not ministries in the main. Ministries are just there to sort of just manage. It's the presidential administration that is essentially the leadership, the governing role. And there we find, particularly within, yes, the press service, but it's also the two key directorates within the presidential administration, one of which handles domestic politics and one of which handles international politics. And so I think it's those three. It's Peskov's press service and the internal and external politics directorates within the presidential administration that I think act as the particularly kind of crucial curators who spot, identify, and talent spot, shall we say, the particular narratives that might be useful more broadly. But as I say, I mean, that's very much the kind of the strategic level. In the main, you see kind of middle level curators doing most of it. So for example, Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry senior press spokesperson, clearly has a role in what particular meme she wishes to put out. And when she takes a particular line, you tend to see that being reflected, particularly in the Twitter feeds. You know, Twitter provides this marvelous model to actually explain sort of what people are saying. If you look at the Twitter feeds of individual embassies around the world, they clearly are looking to Zakharova to sort of set the line. And then they, once again, will seek ways to embroider that or make it more relevant to that particular country. So it's actually an iterative process. People coming up with ideas, curated at different levels above, and as that is signaled, the people at the bottom once again think, okay, right, so we know what we're looking for, let's see what we can do with that. And constantly sort of generate it. But no, I mean, if there had to be one agency, it's the presidential administration.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a question from a diplomat. As a diplomat, I'm interested in fighting disinformation. What is the best approach to fight disinformation without getting in a tit-for-tat approach? Is it discrediting the disinformation apparatus? Is it promoting the virtues of democracy?
The problem of fighting disinformation is that it's almost impossible to do when you're directly kind of trying to grapple with it. Because the people that Russian disinformation speaks to are the kind of people who already start by being skeptical of the authorities. I mean, the very fact that, at the moment, they're more willing to listen to something that Russians are telling them than their own people. So it's very hard to then turn around and say, oh, no, it's not the case. So I think there's really 3 points that one needs to make about sort of resisting disinformation. First of all, don't think that just because you have truth on your side, that counts for anything. Unfortunately, the fact that you are opposing a particular disinformation line, for some people will be proof that there is something to it. Well, if there wasn't something to it, they wouldn't be trying so desperately to get us not talking about it or whatever. Paranoid nonsense, absolutely. But remember, these are people who start by being mistrustful of the official line. So yes, sometimes it is necessary to counter with the truth. But that is not so much to convince the people who are already believing the disinformation. It's to try and almost kind of inoculate people who haven't yet been exposed to the disinformation. Again, if we're using the viral perspective, it is not the cure, it is the vaccine for other people who might otherwise be infected. So point one, yes, truth has a role, but only a limited role. Secondly, again, it's one of these truisms that actually the best way of fighting disinformation is precisely to address people's literacy in terms of media literacy, the legitimacy of existing governments and media and such like, which is a very, very long-term process. You can't just do it in response to an individual tweet. It's something that has to happen, systematically over years and so forth. That is the real way of fighting disinformation. It's actually, restoring legitimacy. Because the reason why the Russians can do what they're doing is precisely because at the moment, anyway, for reasons that have nothing to do with Putin, the West is going through something of a legitimacy crisis. Old structures of governance, of media and so forth are coming under question, and the Russians are taking advantage of it. So at the other end is the very, very big picture of addressing that. But there is scope, and this is the kind of the bit in between where actually people can make a difference. How do you actually resist disinformation? Just simply saying it's not true isn't very helpful. The best way of responding, and again, as near as we can tell from those studies which have been made about really trying to get to grips with actually how people respond to disinformation, is instead when you allow people themselves to discover that it's not true. Tell people it's not true, and actually they will become more stubborn. Instead, present alternative facts that when you put them together, undermine the disinformation. People want to feel that they are active agents in their own learning process. So, if someone says, I don't know, the German government is denying other European countries the right to be able to get hold of vital personal protective equipment, and that's a lie. You could just simply say, no, that's a lie. And, you just get into a tit for tat. On the other hand, if you just separately put out 3 different tweets, press messages, whatever, that actually are identifying, perhaps supplies of German equipment that's going to Italy and patients coming to German hospitals and whatever. So you're not actively trying, you're not overtly just simply saying, I'm fighting back against this disinformation. You are laying out alternative, accurate information that when put together will undermine that disinformation. That seems to be a lot more effective. People want to feel that they themselves have undermined the disinformation, rather than just simply that they are being fed alternative lies by two different platforms. So I don't know if that helps at all. It's really hard. I mean, the honest truth of the matter is this is one of those areas where actually the devil has all the best tunes. The people who are creating disinformation can create the most attractive, interesting, eye-catching stories. And we who are stuck with the truth are always going to be in a weaker position, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just a quick, short follow-up question regarding that. What about ignoring it? Because you have all these conspiracy theories that are so ridiculous, and by trying to discredit them, you're also, feeding it again into more like established channels of communication. So it's also just, the really irrational conspiratorial stuff, just ignoring it also an option here?
Often that is the case. Now, look, there are some sort of particular stories which are just so corrosive that one has to address them. For example, again, take a German example, the Lisa case, about this sort of alleged, Russian-German girl who was abducted and raped by migrants. That was reaching a certain pitch that it absolutely needed to be addressed, and was very, very successfully. Much of the time, though, individual stories, precisely, they will bubble up and then they will disappear of their own accord within an hour or a day or a week. And precisely trying to feel that you have to fight that. This is why I'm very skeptical about a lot of the so-called myth-busting initiatives. I understand why they're appealing, particularly from a bureaucratic perspective, because they lend themselves to metrics. And bureaucrats love metrics. We busted 74 myths last week, and we're going to do 93 this week. But actually, there's very little evidence that that works. And the risk is precisely that what you do is you reward the disinformation outlets by making them seem important. And you bring the disinformation to the attention of people who otherwise might not have heard it. Final, while I think, just a very, very quick also sideline, one of the things we also have to think about is who is spreading the disinformation. If it's just random individuals sharing things on their Facebook page, that's one thing. But a certain amount of the disinformation is actually being repeated by domestic outlets, online news sources and so forth, that don't actually have a pro-Russian agenda. They have a pro-clicks agenda. They want to be visible. They want to feel that they matter. They want people to be following them because often they're advertising revenue. And there are other ways, which we can talk about if you like, about ways of trying to kind of bring those into the fold. But again, if one just simply counters them, actually, that is the best advertising they could possibly want.
So we have another question. Will there or can there come a point when the Kremlin attempts to come out of its own disinformation traps or continue to double down? What sort of signals should we look for to see a change of course, asking for help during the pandemic?
This is interesting because actually what we all have to see, and again, as with everything, we have no idea how this pandemic is going to sort of play out in our own countries, let alone in Russia. And indeed, the Kremlin has no idea how it's going to play out in Russia. One of the things that I think, one of the reasons why I think the Russians are being much more cautious in terms of the not sort of really putting effort into coordinated disinformation campaigns in the West on this basis, is because there is a concern or a fear or a belief that they might actually be needing to look for Western assistance. They are, after all, behind the curve in the sense of they will be peaking later than most Western countries, and I think one of the reasons, one of the many reasons for their sort of high-profile aid to Italy and whether it was aid or not to America is in some ways hoping to kind of establish some brownie points that they can later trade in for assistance if they find themselves in crisis or if it's in anything else. So, I think one thing it will be interesting to see is precisely how Russia begins to try and internalize that we're all in this together model. Because so far, this is essentially for external consumption. Domestically, we haven't yet seen the Kremlin presenting this as a global crisis that needs a global solution to its own people. still very much how we Russians are going to deal with this. So if we see a shift in internal rhetoric towards one that is actually much more kind of positive toward the outside world, I think that will be one very key indicator that they're actually really sort of shifting to that. And then I think they will need to be damping down the disinformation. The second thing is, look, what we have to realize is this. There are many within the Russian system, I think the majority within the Russian system, who have not bought into Putin's notion of some kind of existential political struggle with the West, who do not buy into his whole kind of paranoid worldview. But that doesn't matter so long as Putin and those who are closest to him either believe it or at least are willing to parrot it back to him. The problem is this, that actually I think that Putin genuinely believes that Russia is in a struggle for its own place in the world. And therefore, I think it's going to be very, very hard for Putin to abandon the disinformation weapon, because it's one of the few things that Russia seems to have, that Russia, you know, where Russia really does have an advantage. And I wish I could present a more uplifting vision. But I ultimately think that unless COVID really seems to pose a truly existential crisis for the regime, which it may, but we don't yet have reason to suspect that, I think that at most we will just simply see a temporary dilution, a temporary reduction in the campaign, but that the Kremlin will want to keep, as I said, those troll armies ready. Because once they get out of COVID and once we're back to some kind of business as usual, they will want to revive the campaigns as before.
Okay. So we have a question from a colleague of mine from Italy. Recalling past poisoning of dissidents, do you consider the Russian note to the editor of La Stampa in Italy a threat, quoting the Latin proverb regarding whoever digs the pit will fall into it?
Honest answer is no, for the simple reason that I think the Russian, the Kremlin has a clear understanding that there is a difference between, again, this is a phrase of Putin's, enemies and traitors. Enemies you fight against, traitors you wipe out. Where they have gone after people and killed them, and we're obviously talking about Litvinenko, the attempt to kill Sergei Skripal, both in the UK, the killing of Chechens in Germany and in Turkey. They have all been people, you might say, from the Russians' point of view, were nash, were ours. I mean, the guy killed in Germany was not actually a Russian citizen, but nonetheless, he was ethnically Georgian, so I think they kind of felt they could include him within the sort of the community. Foreigners they will inveigh against, they will happily launch kind of vicious cyber campaigns against or whatever. Killing a foreigner, and especially a newspaper editor or whatever, would be a different order of magnitude. This is not important. I think what this represents is two things. One is, again, a lack of control over the information space. I mean, actually, this was... We've already seen other Russian official sources trying to basically pull back from that particular extreme of rhetoric. They realized that went too far. And secondly, the Russians do believe that we have ridiculous double standards when it comes to them. That we will let the Chinese get away with all kinds of things and call out the Russians for much less sort of evil sins. Now, of course, the Italian mission from Russia with love was a sort of a geopolitical ploy. But I think a lot of Russians, including official Russians, had convinced themselves that it was an act of generosity. And how dare the Italians, how dare La Stampa actually sort of question that. So, I mean, I think this was a kind of emotional response that went a bit too far. I don't think we're going to see anything more serious, because they do understand the difference between killing a Russian and killing a Westerner.
Yeah. So we have time for one last question. Last Thursday, President Donald Trump referred to a Russian medical supply shipment to the US as, quote, aid, and said the United States had accepted a very nice offer from Russian President Vladimir Putin. how can the public educate itself on Russian and Chinese propaganda efforts? What are sources to consider, especially in light of the ongoing pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is I mean, one of the tragic ironies actually is that, you know, we talk about Russian and Chinese disinformation when, you know, arguably the Oval Office is the greatest font of disinformation in the West at the moment. I mean, it's very difficult because it's clear that if you take Donald Trump and a few other individuals out of the equation, you know, there is actually a strong consensus within the West about the nature of the situation, about the Chinese government's responsibility. We may not know exactly the details. We may differ on some of the sort of, you know, where the decimal point goes in terms of deaths covered up, shall we say. But, you know, in essence, there is actually a striking consensus. But that is a quiet consensus compared to the megaphone of certain particular sources, of which Trump is only one, but arguably the most important. So how can we educate ourselves about it? Well, I mean, the glib answer is, well, first of all, just by ignoring everything that Donald Trump says. That's easy, but as I said, glib. But secondly, I mean, I think that what this COVID crisis has thrown up, and in some ways, if one is desperately looking for silver linings in the cloud, it may be one, is precisely once again the role of expertise. We had had a period in which actually there had been, in different ways, in different countries, something of a backlash against the idea of the expert. That almost, again, everyone with a Twitter feed became an expert. And to an extent, we still see this with COVID. But nonetheless, I mean, I think, you know, this has really made it clear that, in fact, there is such a thing as genuine expertise. There is such a thing as objective fact. All issues which in some ways, you know, in the first few years of the 21st century, we seem to feel that everything had become negotiable. So, I mean, I think that's, if I had one sort of point is to make exactly is one has to look at, you know, even understanding that experts have disagreements and some of them will get it wrong and so forth. But nonetheless, you know, what one has to do is not just simply resist Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation because it is disinformation. Instead, we have to benchmark assertions against, insofar as we're able to, objective fact. And I think that is going to be one of the potential positive lessons from this whole miserable crisis. Is actually, you know, it has proven to be a very, very clear example of the fact that facts still exist, that the world has not become an entirely malleable place in which everything can be simply negotiated over your Twitter feed.
That strikes me as a perfect end to our conversation, that facts still exist and facts still matter. Mark, thank you very, very much for your insights, for your valuable insights. And I hope next time we'll meet in Berlin in person. So you're invited to our office when this is possible again to travel and coming to Berlin. And so looking forward for the new stuff you're working on. And again, thank you very, very much. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for listening in, for watching. And yeah, please, Mark, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll have future events, future Zoom events in the coming weeks. So make sure you see our emails. And again, thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for the invitation. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.